My name is Alice Moraga. I use the pronouns she, her, and I am a CGSHE affiliate research fellow in the Faculty of Health Sciences at Simon Fraser University, where I am collaborating on the Gender in COVID-19 project. I will be your moderator for today. And some quick housekeeping, as we have had there, please note that the event will be recorded and posted on our website. If you prefer, for privacy reasons, you can rename yourself to use your first name or a nickname and or turn off your video. And the symposium offers a rare opportunity to learn from a variety of important research affiliated with the center, and also offers an opportunity for the trainees at the center to showcase their work and network with peers and other researchers in the field of gender equity, sexual and reproductive health and justice. Each presenter will have 10 minutes to share their work, and at the end we'll have about 20 minutes for a Q&A session. If you have a question during the presentation, feel free to jot it down in the chat so you don't forget. And if a question is directed to a specific presenter, feel free to include their name, and we will get to those questions during the Q&A session. And without further delay, I will introduce our first presenter. Amrit Tiwana is a BSc student in the Faculty of Health Sciences at Simon Fraser University. She uses pronouns she, her. Amrit will be presenting on her research around conversion therapy in Canada. Welcome, Amrit.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Alice, for the introduction. I'll go ahead and start sharing my screen. Okay, today I'll be presenting my undergraduate thesis with you. The title is Geographic Distribution of Conversion Therapy in Canada. So I'll start off by talking about what is conversion therapy. There's quite a few different terms out there for it. A couple of them are reparative practice, aversion therapy, corrective approach, CGSHE, which stands for sexual orientation and gender identity and expression change efforts. And all of these terms are referring to a treatment, practice, or sustained effort that is designed to suppress, discourage, or change a person's sexual orientation, gender identity, or gender expression. There's no scientific research that proves conversion therapy is effective. In fact, it's found that it's quite harmful and stigmatizing, and about 5 to 20% of LGBTQ people are exposed, which corresponds to thousands of Canadians. The more we studied conversion therapy, the more we felt compelled to situate it at the tip of an iceberg. So conversion therapy really refers to organized, structured activities and circumscribed. For example, a certain number of sessions with a practitioner, such as a counselor. Whereas CGSHE are less well-defined and advertised. And an example of this would be a conversation between a parent and a child in which the child is dissuaded from living with or adopting an LGBTQ identity. And then lastly, both are enabled and condoned by widespread cissexism and heterosexism in societies. And this really refers to a societal belief that heterosexism is the normal way of living. Because these practices are so harmful, there has been political movement. There's a couple of provincial and municipal bans out there, and we're headed towards a federal ban on conversion therapy. So actually just yesterday, the House of Commons unanimously agreed to pass Bill C-4. And so this bill would prohibit causing someone to undergo conversion therapy, removing a minor from Canada to attend conversion therapy abroad, and profiting from providing conversion therapy, and then advertising or promoting conversion therapy. Now, these bans are great, but the problem with criminalization is that it often leads to practices being held underground. And so conversion therapists might just end up still performing these services in discrete ways and continuing to harm thousands of people. So this is really the main driver of my research of trying to figure out where is this still happening. And so the two objectives are to assess whether existing legislative bans are associated with lower prevalence of conversion therapy, and then to examine the geospatial patterning of conversion therapy across Canadian provinces and territories. To start off, my research team launched a survey in the fall of 2020 to understand people's experiences of conversion therapy in Canada. To be eligible, you had to either experience conversion therapy or know someone who has. You had to be 19 or older and live in Canada. We had about 110 respondents, and one of the sections in the survey asked, do you know of any locations out there? And so we had about 31 people answer really the question about where is this still happening? My first step was to examine the existing bans in Canada. So as of August 2020, which is really right before we started data collection, 3 Canadian provinces, Ontario, Nova Scotia, and Prince Edward Island, and several Canadian municipalities, including Calgary and Vancouver, have banned conversion therapy. This is what the raw data looks like. So I mentioned that we had 31 respondents answer the question of where this is happening. And from those 31 respondents, I was able to pull 119 identified locations. So what we're seeing here is kind of count data. And you can see that the hotspots include Vancouver, all around Alberta, somewhere around London, Toronto, and then Gatineau in Quebec. I just want to point out there's several limitations to this. So we might be seeing Vancouver as such a hotspot just because the survey did launch in Vancouver. So we had more people fill out the survey in this area. And then also majority of the Canadian population lives along the Canada southern US border. So that's why the data is like heavily skewed towards the bottom. But I think what this is highlighting is that even though there's a provincial ban in, say, Ontario, we're still getting data of practices being reported. And then lastly, I took into account the population density. So this is the prevalence of conversion therapy per 1 million population. And we're seeing a higher prevalence in the West and the Atlantic. But I would exercise caution in interpreting estimates from provinces and territories with numerators less than 5, such as Yukon, Prince Edward Island, and Newfoundland. And then no data is available for Northwest Territories and Nunavut. Yeah, so this is just the lower color, or sorry, the lighter color is lower prevalence, and then the darker color is higher prevalence. Bans are great, but we think it won't fully eliminate conversion therapy. So we need to continuously invest in and support social environments. So this would include supporting gay straight alliances, pride flags, and other interventions that remind people that LGBTQ identities are valid. And then another thing is the creation of LGBTQ affirming education, including sex education, which Action Canada is currently working on. And then lastly, research. We need to keep monitoring where this is happening in order to hold legislators accountable and to know where social support environments are most needed. And that brings me to the end of my presentation. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Amrit, for that very insightful presentation. And I apologize, we actually do not have live transcript for our event today. And next, I would like to go to Nikki Ovesi, and an MPH student with the Faculty of Pharmaceutical Sciences at the University of British Columbia. Nikki uses pronouns she, her, and will be sharing her research on the experience of nurses in British Columbia during the COVID pandemic. Please feel free to jot down any questions you might have in the chat. Welcome, Nikki.
Thanks, everyone. So hello, my name is Nikki Ovesi. I use the pronouns she, her, and I am here to present the findings from the Risk and Resilience Research Project. More specifically, I am presenting on the experiences of nurses during COVID-19 in British Columbia. So I assisted on this research under the supervision of Dr. Julia Smith and Rosemary Morgan. Okay. So I would also like to acknowledge that I am currently on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish peoples, and I am very thankful to have the opportunity to conduct my life, work, and play on this land. Okay. So just as some background, so previous studies have established that pandemics and other natural disasters play a very major role in exacerbating gender disparities in the healthcare workforce that already exist. However, there is a lack of research that critically analyzes the gendered impacts of these crises. So our study actually addressed this gap by focusing on how gender dynamics shape the experiences of women healthcare workers in BC during COVID-19. So as many of you may know, around 90.2% of nurses in BC identify as women. And in addition to this, Canadian women are often occupying the primary care role in their families. So they engage in nearly double the amount of unpaid work than their male counterparts. And due to this intersection, they are also responsible for a large bulk of COVID-19 related works, both in the home and in the healthcare facility. So this leads to heavy workloads. And of course, we know that there's already staff shortages and lack of leadership opportunities for women identifying individuals. So also in 2010, the Canadian Nurses Association conducted a research project, and they saw that 68% of nurses actually reported the effects of sleep deprivation. So this, of course, means an impact of their quality of work, as well as the safety of themselves and the patients that they're working with. More recently, the BC's Nurses Union actually released a report based on the nurses' experience in British Columbia in COVID-19, and they actually saw that 76% had an increase of workload, 35% intended to leave within the next few years because of their experiences now, and 82% have had mental health impacts because of their experience during the pandemic. So there's a lot of problems going on here. So what we did to address this gap is we actually conducted a qualitative research project. So we had 11 nurses in 4 focus groups, and we also had 2 semi-structured individual interviews as well. So this all occurred over a period of 2 months, January to February 2021, and we actually conducted a framework analysis of the data as well. So ethics approval was of course provided by Simon Fraser, and all participants provided informed consent. So what did we find? So with qualitative data at the end, we resolved with themes. For us, we had 4 major themes. So it was on the health system level, community and household level, individual level, as well as just like the long-term implications. So for the health system level, we did see large concerns about the lack of appropriate and accessible PPE, which then relates to infection with COVID-19. So there was a lot of concerns there. In addition to that, protocols were changing so often and so rapidly, and knowledge was not being translated properly through the ranks. So people and nurses, they just did not know what to do in many situations that they may be unsafe to themselves or the patients. In addition, there were increased workloads, of course, a lot of moral obligations towards their patients, lack of financial support, and exclusion from decision-making. So as we know, a lot of these problems did exist prior to this crisis as well, but again, they are being exacerbated, especially in terms of gender. So for the community and household level factors, there were a lot of misinformation, stigma towards the nurses within their own community. And this, of course, went hand in hand with a fear of infecting their friends, their families, their community. And like I mentioned, since 90% of nurses in BC do identify as women, and we know that women are taking on more childcare. The fact that childcare infrastructures were closed down meant that there was so much more challenge and more work for women nurses to actually take up during this time, which then relates to, of course, difficulties maintaining a work-life balance. On an individual level, of course, physical health impacts in terms of having to do more work, being exposed to COVID-19, being infected, having potential long-term impacts on their health, mental health impacts in terms of being extremely stressed out and burnt out, occupational burnout. And all of this led to long-term implications wherein a lot of our participants did bring up to us that they suspect increased attrition within the next few years. So although, of course, I cannot show all the data that we collected, I do want to highlight a few quotes. So on the top, someone said, I was diagnosed with severe depression, severe anxiety in the context of post-traumatic stress disorder. I've never had mental health issues in my entire life. I can actually talk about that today without crying, but 7 months ago, if you asked me how it was work, I burst into tears and shut down. So this, of course, refers to the individual level impacts that we were talking about in terms of mental health. And this was very, very common in the conversations that we had with nurses. At the bottom, it's upsetting because there's a few moments on my last couple of sets where I couldn't get into the room on time. I have to properly protect myself with a mask and gloves. But meanwhile, the patient is crashing and I cannot get there on time. So she ended up dying. So this is very, very unfortunate and difficult to see and to hear, and of course, even more to experience. And this relates to a couple of things. One, that of course, maybe protocols are not being consulted with nurses at the table in the leadership, and they would of course advise us certain things are just not possible. And yeah, just overall with protocols and access to resources. This top one is relating to if you have to go off work because you might be positive for COVID, we're not going to pay you for that. It's going to come out of your sick leave or you get unpaid leave. So the infrastructure of payment and leave and just overall compensation did not change, even though individuals were, of course, having to take more sick leaves, either because of mental health concerns or because of actually being infected by COVID-19. So this is a huge infrastructure problem. At the bottom, we were not prepared. They all talked about, oh, pandemic planning. We're all prepared from the start. No, we failed. We sucked. We did a horrible job, and the healthcare workers are going to pay for it mentally for many years after this. So this, of course, refers to the attrition that we believe we're going to see both now and in the next few years. So, of course, based off of everything, we do have recommendations that we hope will get integrated on a policy level. So definitely, first, we need PPE to be available and appropriate for healthcare workers and continually available. Secondly, there needs to be paid leave and benefits to healthcare workers who are infected, or they may need mental health support, or they have to take care of dependents who are either in the same situation. So, of course, we also want to see more training and education for healthcare workers to be aware of new protocols. And if they need to take a day to actually do this training and education, it should still be paid. On a more systems level, there needs to be hiring of more nurses so the system doesn't get so stressed in these times of crises. Of course, there needs to be an increased representation of women healthcare workers in leadership and decision-making, childcare support, preferably on site, and work that can be done at home, like admin work or just education. If that could be done at home or asynchronously, that would, of course, be extremely beneficial as well. So a huge thank you to our funders, our participants, and supporters through this extensive project.
Thank you, Nikki, for that really insightful presentation on healthcare workers' experience. And next, we will hear from Jenny Pearson, a PhD student at the University of British Columbia's Interdisciplinary Studies, also collaborating on knowledge translation and community engagement with the Aisha project based at the center. Jenny uses she, her pronouns and will be presenting on ongoing research into the impacts of the pandemic on sex workers. So a great continuation from Nikki's work. Welcome, Jenny.
Thank you for the introduction. I will be talking today about sex workers' access to government relief funds during COVID-19, or CERB, the Canadian Emergency Response Benefit. And this is part of the Aisha research project hosted here at the center. So yeah, a bit of background about sex workers' experiences during COVID-19 and access to structural support. So during the beginning of the pandemic and still into the year and a half, 2 years of the pandemic, COVID really brought into focus the urgent need to address the unmet occupational health and safety needs of sex workers, and in addition to other precarious and informal workers, particularly around their access to structural supports and funding provided by governments. In the Canadian context, the community really highlighted the inequitable access in the way that the Canadian Emergency Response Benefit was set up. And while folks were largely unable to access this fund, community groups also kind of scaled up their efforts to be able to provide direct income support to their members. We saw this in Vancouver with folks like PACE providing up to $150,000 to their members, and other cities in Canada also setting up emergency funds when the government let sex workers down. Yeah, and a lot of folks have really given some great insight into how CERB, the Canadian Emergency Response Benefit, was not set up for sex workers and other precarious and undocumented workers, just due to the barriers created due to the way CERB was linked to folks' taxes filing. There was also a minimum income you needed to report in 2019 to be able to get CERB. And this process required using your legal name, and some folks may not even have access to direct deposits or check systems that were required for CERB access. So while it was intended to be low barrier, there was still folks who were being left behind. In light of this and this community discussion, we at Aisha really wanted to understand who was able to access CERB, and what was the relationship between accessing or not accessing CERB and experiences during COVID related to sex workers' health, safety, and well-being. So a bit more background, this work is nested within Aisha, an evaluation of sex workers' health access, which is an existing prospective cohort here at the center. We have a cohort of about 900 sex workers in Metro Vancouver, and this work has been ongoing since 2010. When COVID began in March of 2020, we implemented a supplemental survey specifically related to experiences during COVID-19. And we collected data from about 200 of our cohort members over the span of a year. For my presentation today, we use bivariate and multivariate logistic regression modeling to understand the correlates of CERB access during the pandemic. So our primary outcome variable was, yes, access to the Canadian Emergency Response Benefit. So folks were able to choose from a list of government supports that they had accessed during the pandemic. And this includes folks who maybe only accessed CERB for 1 month, even though CERB was available for, I believe, up to 5 months. So this captures anyone who was able to get at least one payment of CERB. Our independent variables included many individual interpersonal factors, structural determinants of health, as well as experiences of structural violence. We also introduced a lot of other economic and income variables. So if folks had ever been cut off or denied welfare, if they were already receiving any type of government benefits, if they had access to an independent bank account, and we captured descriptive reasons as to why people didn't apply to CERB or were deemed ineligible for CERB, which I'm happy to discuss a bit more later. Early on, we created a bit of a time map to really look at when people were able to access CERB and to see if there's any connection there. And as you can see, by June of 2020, a lot of our members or a lot of our participants had been able to receive at least one CERB payment. We see that kind of dip down later on in the pandemic and then continue to decline as the CERB program closed and then the CRB program opened up. And we actually had virtually no participants respond that they had been successful in obtaining CRB, which had a even less accessible application process. And sorry, just to summarize, 49% of our 207 participants had accessed CERB at any point during the pandemic. So descriptively, who accessed CERB, we can see that Indigenous sex workers were actually less likely to have accessed CERB. Folks who had experienced unstable housing in the last 6 months or who reported recent non-injection drug use were more likely to access CERB. And what were some of the experiences people faced during COVID-19 and how does that relate to whether or not they had CERB? So we can see that overall, most sex workers in our cohort experienced reduced income from in-person sex work, reduced food security, and negative changes to their emotional and psychological well-being. We can see that folks who were able to access CERB had less odds of negative changes to food security. In our bivariate and multivariate explanatory analysis, in our final multivariate model, we did find that CERB access was correlated with reduced odds of negative changes to food security and also with recent non-injection drug use. So what does this data say? Overall, compared to women in other service roles and low-income workers of all genders, sex workers reported relatively reduced access to CERB. CERB access was also found to be less likely among Indigenous sex workers, while nationally Indigenous people in other service industries were found to be overrepresented in CERB access. So this points to a very unique barrier to CERB for particularly Indigenous people who have done sex work. And this is something I would like to discuss and explore more further. As well, the connection between non-injection drug use and CERB access may lead us to consider the ways that services tailored to sex workers who use drugs or who may be part of supportive housing. These services might have aided sex workers in signing up from CERB. Just from community discourse with some of our partners, we do know that a lot of organizations were really putting in time and helping their members sign up for CERB and walk them through the process. So that's some community literature that I hope to explore more for this analysis. And while overall our participant group did experience very high rates of food insecurity, CERB was had a protective effect on this, and we can see a clear linkage between helping folks with consistent income and being able to have enough food to eat. And for my recommendations, there's an ongoing and outstanding need to scale up community-led organizing and sex worker-friendly housing and harm reduction services so that more folks can have these linkages with people who want to help them get set up for income supports. We need actual low barrier basic income available to all informal, criminalized and undocumented workers. This way, sex workers can work safely when they need to and under the conditions that best support their overall well-being. And of course, the decriminalization of sex work and recognition of sex work as legitimate occupation are important steps in assuring that sex workers will have equal access to any future structural income supports that are introduced. And that's all for me. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for that, Jenny. It was very insightful. Next, I would like to introduce Mother Gumprich, an MSc student in the Faculty of Health Sciences at Simon Fraser University. Mother uses pronouns they, she, and will be presenting on their work on non-binary individuals involved in Canadian sport. Welcome, Mother, and please feel free to jot down questions in the chat. Welcome, Mother.
Thank you so much for that introduction, and we're going to get right into it. So I'm Martha, I use they, she pronouns, and I'm supervised by Dr. Travis Salway, and my thesis is looking at investigating the experiences of non-binary youth in organized sport in Canada. So first, I want us all to start off and make sure that we're on the same page with some definitions. So when someone is transgender, it means that their gender identity differs from their sex assigned at birth, and they also may be expressing their gender differently from what is conventionally expected of them. Someone who's non-binary may also express their gender differently from their sex or / gender assigned at birth, and identify as neither a male or female or man or woman, identify as both or as neither. So I wanted to showcase some professional non-binary athletes who are frankly killing it in sport and just absolutely amazing advocates for being non-binary in sport. These pictures, I really wanted to show some non-binary joy in sport as well, as that's often kind of hard to find. So some background on this topic. Sexism and homophobia are wildly pervasive in sport and often go without punishment. And this can lead to exclusionary policies in sport, leaving out trans and non-binary people. A study of Anglo-American countries found that 80% of the lesbian, gay, and bisexual participants have either seen or experienced homophobia in sport. And in another study, over 80% of the surveyed women experienced systemic sexism, and 80% witnessed direct sexism. And while homophobia and sexism aren't directly linked to non-binary exclusion, they're very intertwined in all of the studies that have already been done and are really difficult to separate for this presentation. So some barriers to participation for non-binary people include teams that are organized by binary genders, meaning most teams are only men's or women's, and most often people can't go between those two teams. Gender change rooms are another big barrier. And while gender neutral change rooms seem like a very simple solution, most people's reactions to this idea are this person's on the left space. A lot of people also may worry about passing or appearing as a cis man or cis woman. Uniform and clothing regulations, particularly in swimming and swimsuits. When you're wearing a swimsuit, a lot of skin is being shown, and that can lead to a lot of gender dysphoria and body dissatisfaction. So understandably, people won't participate. And very little to no research has been done looking at non-binary people in sport in Canada. So this is very new. And I do understand that a lot of these things I'm suggesting are organizational and structural changes, something that we all know is very difficult to bring about, but that doesn't mean that it shouldn't and can't be done, because how we're doing sport right now is not working for a lot of people and it's hurting a lot of people. And I think a great way of rethinking our way of doing sport is captured by Eric and all here, when they say genuine non-binary inclusion entails not only a radical rethinking of the operation of sex and gender in sport, but also alternative ways of participating and experience sport that entail a rethinking of the meaning of sport itself. So who are these participants? Where are these stats coming from? It's really important to remember, especially for this study, that these are people. They have lived experience. They're me, they're nearly every single person I've ever encountered in sport. We all share these stories. I've been in sports since I was 5 and I'm now 23. I also did my undergrad in kinesiology and a certificate in athletic therapy. So I've been working in sports and varsity athletics specifically for the past 5 years. And not to say I've seen things, but I've seen a lot of things. When I was 12, one of my friends was on a women's hockey team, a girls hockey team. And one of her friends checked an opponent into the boards and the opponent called her a slut. And while this isn't directly related to homophobia, this shows that at age 12, people are already sex shaming and just have this idea that it's okay to say mean things to each other. 4 years ago, I was working for a varsity men's soccer team, and it was in Ontario, an outdoor game, so it was very cold. one of the players wanted gloves and I offered him mine. And when he saw them, he looked at them and said, I don't know, aren't those a little gay? And I was absolutely shocked that he said this. So I sarcastically responded saying, oh, sorry, my free offering to you isn't good enough. And in that moment, without meaning to, I equated being gay with not being good enough. And there's a lot to unpack there, being that I'm queer myself and said these things and inadvertently attributed to these stats. When I first moved here to Burnaby in September, I wanted to join a swim team. So I was contacting the coach. Things were going very well, very smoothly, looking great. But I wanted to kind of get out ahead of these potential gender issues I might face as a non-binary person. So I asked the coach if they had any non-binary and trans swimmers on the team, and if not, if they're open to having some. His response was, to my knowledge, we only have M/F swimmers, didn't put a period, didn't sign the email, sent it, and that was that. So I didn't really take that as a great sign. I didn't want to be their little guinea pig and have to deal with all that, because I wanted to make new friends, meet new people in this new city, and be able to stay active and frankly get away from all of this and have swimming as my break. But that didn't work. I didn't meet anyone. I'm still not swimming. I didn't make any new friends. And at the time, for me, it was much more than those things. A lot of close family members knew that I wanted to swim for this team, but didn't know that I was non-binary. So I didn't know what to tell them. I know I didn't want to out myself to them, but I also didn't want to lie to them. So this shows that this has big impacts for a lot of people. And these discriminatory attitudes and comments do not stay at the rink or on the field. They stay with the person. So what do I want to do about this? I'm now working for Dr. Travis Salway, and I'm a research assistant on the Unicorn Study, which stands for Understanding, Affirming Communities, Relationships, and Networks. It is a Canada-wide study for those ages 15 to 29, and it'll be launching in this January. We're hoping to recruit 2,000 respondents in both English and French, and we'll be marketing across social media platforms, ads on public transit, and sports leagues in Canada. And it's very exciting that I've been in contact with some sports leagues already, and BC Soccer and Soccer Nova Scotia have agreed to help recruit participants from all of their teams. So some topics I'll be including include avoidance of leaving sport because of cissexism or heterosexism, felt safety and acceptance of gender identity and perceived causes of gender exclusion, felt need to change gender expression in sport, inclusion of non-binary and transgender people in queer sports leagues, because not all queer teams are gender affirming and gender inclusive, and also looking at mental health for these people, including depression, anxiety, and suicidality. What do I want to do once I have these results? A lot of things. So first, I'll approach the partners to see how they want the results. I want the most buy-in for these results as possible. So I want them to get the results in ways that they care about and will actually use, and hopefully use to take action and inform policy within their teams. I also hope to change some coaching modules. Every coach has to take a certification program before they begin coaching. And I hope that if coaches receive information and knowledge about non-binary and transgender athletes, they'll be much more accepting and just less weird and awkward around these athletes. I also hope to inform better policies for transgender non-binary athletes, as a lot of teams operate on a case-by-case basis, which is highly inequitable and leads to a lot of unfairness in sport when one team might have a very progressive mindset and another does not. And that is my whole presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Martha. That was so informative. And I look forward to, I'm guessing we all look forward to, what you find with Unicorn. Thanks for sharing. Next, we have Alex Kozouchowski, an MPH in the faculty, an MPH student in the Faculty of Health Sciences at Simon Fraser University. Alex uses pronouns he, him, and will be presenting on experiences of women working in long-term care facilities in British Columbia during the pandemic. Welcome, Alex.
Thank you so much, Alice. Yeah, so like as Alice mentioned, I am going to be presenting some qualitative work that I was involved in as a research assistant, looking into the experiences of women working in long-term care facilities in BC during COVID-19. I feel like it's necessary for me to quickly mention positionality. As me being a white man, I'm not necessarily the person best fitted to be presenting this work. Of course, that being the fact that it's about women, but also many women working in long-term care are also women of color. And so my intersecting identities obviously come with a lot of privilege that aren't afforded by these women. And so that obviously comes with a lot of reflexivity and humility on my part. Ultimately, me presenting here was a bit of a last-minute decision, and my PIs and I felt like there was a lot of important work to be presented here. And so we really wanted to make sure that we get the word out about it. So with that said, I do want to highlight the fact that this is a women-led project. And so I want to give thanks to our two primary investigators, Dr. Julia Smith and Dr. Rosemary Morgan, as well as Hang Li Tan, Nikki Ovesi, who presented earlier, Christina Mehmet, Kate Hawkins, as well as the support that we got from the BC Women's Health Foundation. And so as with Nikki's work, this is part of a larger project called the Gender and COVID Project, and specifically the Risk and Resilience in the Workforce Project. And so this looked at identifying the effects of COVID-19 on women's health and care workers, mental and physical health, as well as the effect that it had on the worker supply and the quality of care. It looked to explore women's role in COVID-19 leadership and gender inclusive responses to COVID-19, if any. And it also looked to investigate gender differential impacts of measures to support the health and care workers during COVID-19. And so this will kind of come into play with when we consider things like childcare and caring for dependents. And lastly, the project looked to provide guidance to decision makers on the healthcare system broadly and what we can do to make it more inclusive and approachable for women. So some context for the project, specifically on long-term care. First of all, we need to acknowledge the fact that women constitute approximately 80% of people working in the health and social assistance sector. As I mentioned earlier, many of these women are new immigrants and women of color, and many of them also work in a privatized role, which is really important because it has a lot to do with the amount that they're paid and their benefits amongst job security as well. And with long-term care specifically, one thing that we need to really focus on and acknowledge is the fact that during the first 2 waves of the pandemic, COVID-19 deaths, about 69% of COVID-19 deaths were attributable to long-term care residents. So as you can see, women working in long-term care have a much higher exposure to COVID-19. And this is also coupled with the fact that during COVID-19, they were confronted with a lot more financial challenges, due to factors such as the gendered wage gap, amongst other things, and also had an increased workload, particularly in the home, caring for dependents and children. So for this project, we recruited women working in long-term care through emails that we disseminated by unions and social media advertisements. In total, we conducted 5 focus groups and 2 semi-structured interviews with care aides and those in similar roles. And also we conducted 2 focus groups with custodial and food service workers who happen to also be working in long-term care and therefore experience a lot of the same issues and outcomes. And so we took a framework approach with our analysis, and this involved, I won't get too deep into it, but it involved first identifying 4 main domains of analysis, those being individual level, household and community level, and then health system level issues. And the 4th domain was what we called measures to address, which were based off of direct feedback from our participants on things to address, whether it be policy or individual level changes that they want to see themselves. And this was reflected in a policy brief that we wrote with recommendations. At this stage, I should also mention as well that because this is a project about women, I was not involved in the data collection process. And at that phase of the project, I took a more sort of behind the scenes role, so helping either clean or de-identify transcripts. And this was obviously to ensure that, we provided a safe space for these women to discuss their problems. So that leads us to the kind of bulk of this, which are our findings. I just want to highlight the fact that I am presenting this in a sort of linear fashion, but it's important to understand the fact that all of these issues do actually occur concurrently. They all happen at the same time. It's just the fact that some of them inform one another and sort of exacerbate them. And so you'll kind of like see that as I explain them. So firstly, at a health systems level, communication was a widely discussed issue with many women working in long-term care. And this came predominantly in the form of language barriers. A lot of women pointed to the fact that a lot of information, whether it's procedural or otherwise, was not provided in multiple languages. And this was, of course, an issue in a highly racialized workplace. And also, a lot of information was distributed through emails, which obviously requires a computer or a phone. And for many women, this was either very inconvenient or just outright inaccessible to disseminate information this way. Ultimately, a lot of information sort of trickled down through multiple different sources to women on the ground level. And oftentimes the procedures that they were given from different sources, such as the health authority or their direct superiors, conflicted with one another. And at the end of the day, women had no sort of means to participate in decision making and either critique the procedures that were coming through or participate in making changes to those. So this, along with many other things, led to staffing shortages and work burden for those working in long-term care. In terms of staffing shortages, one woman working as a care aide pointed out the fact that their site kind of acts as like a revolving door. So you'll see a lot of people kind of coming in or a lot of women coming in, but also the same amount of women or more leaving the sector. And this is for various reasons, including burnout and also low pay, which kind of goes back to the fact that a lot of these women work in privatized roles where they have little negotiation for their wages. So this, of course, causes this vicious cycle with work burden, where the women that remain working in long-term care have an additional workload to take on because there is not enough people to attend to all the responsibilities of a long-term care worker. And of course, this leads to more burnout, which then leads to more staffing shortages, and you can kind of see how it goes along. Ultimately, what this results in is the fact that many women that remain working in long-term care are not able to provide the appropriate care to residents because of things such as the staffing ratio for the amount of residents that one staff person has to tend to is like completely infeasible and impossible to deal with. And so what ends up happening is that residents end up suffering. And one care worker highlighted the fact that certain residents would miss baths for weeks at a time. And this is by no means a reflection of the care workers themselves, but the care system as a whole and how unsustainable it is. And so what ends up happening is that many of these women, or rather all of these women, are very cognizant of the impact that they have on residents. And one woman highlighted that, this field, it attracts people that care about others. Like they're invested in the principles of care. And so ultimately, when they see that they have an inability and they see the results of their inability to provide appropriate care, this sort of results in a lot of emotional and mental strain on the workers. And one care describes kind of like leaving work with like a heavy burden and heavy guilt, knowing the fact that they didn't tend to all of their residents' needs. So all of these together, you can kind of already see like all these problems kind of like stack on top of one another. And ultimately, both the workers at these sites and also the residents end up suffering because the care system as a whole is really unsustainable. And to make matters worse is a lot of residents, they are not receiving support from families. There's no more volunteers coming in due to COVID. And so a lot of them are upset. They feel lonely. They feel sad. And many care workers that we interviewed highlighted the fact that this ends up resulting in them lashing out or acting out. And so many women, unfortunately, describe violence in the workplace as a norm. One care aide described the fact that they had a calendar that they had to mark every day with a red dot if anyone experienced violence, and how at the end of every month, that calendar would be marked like completely red. So there was a red dot on every single day. And it got to the point where this was so normalized and such a recurring event for women working in long-term care, to the point that one of our participants highlighted that they didn't even report it anymore, that it felt kind of pointless, and they didn't really see the results of both reporting and noting on a calendar how many times they experienced violence. It just ended up feeling like a bit nebulous and fruitless. So this is one quote that I just want to read out from from one of our focus groups. So the one thing I really want people to know is that sometimes it's just really hard. Like, I don't even want to get out of bed. They then go on to say that even though I'm not a nurse and I haven't had anybody who's had COVID at my site, it's still very scary. And so this kind of, I saw the necessity to share this because, first of all, this participant said that they wanted people to know this information, but they also highlighted a key factor here, which is the sort of like dissonance between the role of a care aide and a nurse, and how there's not an acknowledgement for the fact that care aides, they deal with the similar burdens to nurse, and they also have their unique set of burdens as well. And so moving on, another quote that I want to share was, I'll just read it out. I was worried that I was going to be I was worried that I was going to be the one to take it into work. So I walked around, as we all have, with so much angst, and every day would be tears and hoping that I didn't have it, and I wanted to not be around my family because I didn't want them to give me something and me take it into work. And so this kind of goes back to highlighting how intimately aware care workers are with the effect that they have on residents, and they obviously care about them deeply, to the point where they'll even compromise the relationships with their own families to ensure that residents are safe. So from the research that we did, we wrote a policy brief. We developed 9 recommendations in total, but I'm only going to read out these 5, and I think I'm actually going over time right now. So I'll just quickly list them off. So adjustment of staff to resident ratios. Another recommendation we have is comparable sick benefits and compensation when workers are understaffed, and this reflects also what the benefits that other people working in healthcare have. Subsidized and accessible childcare services that reflect the fact that these women work in very precarious working hours. Appropriate and accessible grievance procedures to provide them a better voice. And finally, culturally competent communication strategies that acknowledge language barriers. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing that, Alex. I think you brought in an important voice of women who might not be very visible when we speak about women in the front lines. Thank you for that. And last but not least, we have Brett Koenig, MSc student in the School of Population and Public Health at the University of British Columbia. Brett uses pronouns they, he, and will be presenting their research on violence reporting among men and non-binary sex workers. Welcome, Brett.
Thank you so much. I'm very excited to be here, very excited to see all these incredible presentations. The diversity of research interests is just, I'm obsessed with it. So thank you so much for the previous presenters as well. So yeah, today I'm going to be presenting this paper that's based on some findings that I'm preparing with a bunch of wonderful co-authors, and it's part of my thesis. And it looks at the intersecting barriers to reporting violence among men and non-binary sex workers under end-demand criminalization in Canada. So for those of you who don't know, this is it. For those of you who don't know, in 2014, the Government of Canada enacted the Protection of Communities and Exploited Persons Act, which criminalized key aspects of sex work, such as purchasing sex while maintaining the legality of selling it. So this end-demand model has been shown to compromise occupational health and safety of sex workers, contributing to higher levels of violence, barriers reporting violence. However, the research on the impacts of criminalization has really largely focused on cisgender women and transgender women, while the experiences of men and non-binary sex workers under criminalization, especially regarding violence and their ability to report violence, remains largely understudied. So to address this gap, we looked at how end-demand criminalization and intersecting structural conditions shape men and non-binary sex workers' experiences reporting violence within Canada. So as part of the qualitative arm of Aisha, which Jenny earlier outlined, we conducted 21 qualitative interviews with trans and cis men and non-binary sex workers in Vancouver and on Vancouver Island, including one trans woman who had identified and worked as a cis man in the previous year. So between September 2020 and August 2021, interviews were conducted via Zoom, over the phone, and in person due to COVID, and lasted between 30 minutes to 2.5 hours, which resulted in some really rich data. So to facilitate our inductive and deductive analysis, we adapted a structural determinants of health model with an emphasis on intersectionality. So a bit of a summary of participant demographics to contextualize the results. Of the 21, 16 were from Vancouver, while 5 were from Vancouver Island. The median age was 34, 11 were white or indigenous, and 6 were mixed ethnicity. There was variation in gender identity, with 11 identifying as cis men, 2 as trans men, 1 as two-spirit, 6 as gender fluid or non-binary, and 1 as a trans woman. 9 noted that they use criminalized substances at least 3 to 4 times a week, and 4 indicated they had no fixed address. So right away, most participants felt that sex work was not inherently dangerous, and that they had control over most of their transactions. However, like many other jobs, standalone incidents of workplace violence did occur, and when it did, many spoke to feeling a strong moral obligation to report in order to help others. However, again, many describe that their only feasible mode of reporting involved the police, which led to several intersecting barriers. So Adrian, all of these are pseudonyms, by the way, a Métis white cis man noted this obligation and resulting conflict, stating that I'll consider reporting if doing so is pretty damn sure to save somebody else or to prevent it from happening to somebody else are probably the only circumstances in which I would. I wouldn't be able to live with myself if I had it within my means to prevent it from happening, and I didn't do it. So as Adrian alludes to, the decision to report is often made more difficult through a number of intersecting barriers. Under end-demand criminalization, despite selling sex not being illegal in those contexts, participants describe being constructed as criminals and feeling stigmatized, leading them to fear criminalization and disbelief if they reported violence to the police that occurred in the context of sex work. Kai demonstrates this point by describing the decision not to report a violent event to the police. They say, I told the doctors, but I didn't go as far as being like, I didn't go to the police because this person's going to deny that it ever happened. I, at the time, thought escorting was illegal. So I thought it was like, okay, well, I'm not going to go to the police. So I thought I would get blowback from escorting, and I also didn't think anything would come from it. So while Kai mentioned how sex work criminalization and stigma shape their experience reporting, others highlighted how other forms of criminalization also contribute to the barriers that men and non-binary sex workers faced. Particularly, those who use criminalized substances described feeling that they would be perceived as perpetrators of crimes despite having just been victimized if they reported. Participants also spoke to how police in particular stigmatize those with histories of previous criminal activity, which further deterred men and non-binary sex workers from reporting. So Bryn, a trans woman, discusses not being able to report a violent event while working due to having criminalized drugs on her. She says, no, I did not report. It was 9 a.m. I had stuff in my bags. Yeah, I'm not going to go to the cops. So through her experience with possessing criminalized drugs, Bryn outlines how substance use criminalization contributes to the barriers that men and non-binary sex workers face to reporting. Additionally, participants spoke to being both surveilled and harassed by the police due to anti-Indigenous racism and intersecting anti-poverty stigma, which among our participants often went hand in hand. So those who experienced the most visibility often faced harassment, stigma, and racism from the police, and not only within the context of sex work, which further limited certain men and non-binary sex workers' ability to report when the police were involved. So Alex, a Two-Spirit Indigenous participant, described how anti-Indigenous racism that she experienced as a teenager contributed to the barriers she faced reporting occupational violence that she experienced as an adult, and says, I wouldn't feel comfortable going to the police. I've just had really bad experiences with the police, even when I was calling them for help when I was a teenager. It's much worse in another Canadian province, like the cops just hate Indigenous people. So as demonstrated by Alex, anti-Indigenous racism had ongoing effects that led her to experiencing the police as a form of violence, and ultimately deterred reporting violence in the context of sex work. So lastly, participants described how gender stereotypes excluded men and non-binary sex workers from being seen as legitimate victims. And spoke to how they experienced homophobia and transphobia when they did report, further contributing to the barriers they experienced. So Scott describes this concept, demonstrating how men and non-binary sex workers are systematically excluded from accessing supports based on gender, and says, it's like female sex workers exist because everyone is straight and men are dogs. And so men hire women and male sex workers don't exist because gay people don't exist, because that's the thing. So when we do sort of break these rigid imagined boundaries, it becomes, you face things like homophobia, you face issues of like, well, you're not an ideal victim, the victim I imagine. How do I help you? I don't. So as emphasized throughout these findings, participants highlighted how police-based systems of reporting violence were often ineffective and caused further harm to those who had experienced violence. Few discussed alternative modes of reporting, such as bad date sheets, but those who did felt that they were most accessible to women sex workers, especially those that solicited outdoors. Others felt that sex work criminalization further constrained their ability to even imagine alternative modes of reporting violence and obtaining actual justice. So to summarize this point, Joey outlines the importance of alternative modes of reporting and says, I don't think the police are our advocates. It's not the police or the community at large, it's the community within our communities that keep us safe. For Joey, as others, staying safe while working meant not relying on the police, but actually relying on each other. So to conclude, these findings are some of the first to demonstrate how end-demand criminalization and intersecting structural conditions shape men and non-binary sex workers' ability to report violence. These findings also support the need to develop community-based systems for reporting violence that account for gender and other intersecting identities, especially indigeneity and homelessness, in order to improve the occupational health and safety for men and non-binary sex workers. Additionally, these findings support the immediate review of PCPA, which is long overdue, and the decriminalization of both sex work and substance use while prioritizing experiential voices in the process. So a huge thank you to the qualitative team, the Aisha team, all the community advisory boards, especially him and Hustle and East Vancouver, who have been instrumental in this. So that is it. Thank you so much.
Thank you for that, Brett. I want to thank all the 6 presenters. This has been so insightful. We've been able to learn so much within such a short time. You did a stellar job. And I'm just impressed by your time management skills. You all managed to do it in 10 minutes. And thank you, attendees, for your attention. So I will go straight to our Q&A. And if you have questions, feel free to just jot them down in the chat. But I think we will also get an opportunity for you to voice your questions if you prefer that. And we have a first question from Julia Smith to Jenny. Do you have a sense of if and how the end of the CRB, this was what replaced the SERB, will affect sex workers?
Yeah, thanks, Julia, for that question. Like I briefly got to speak to in my presentation, our COVID supplement did ask folks about experiences with CRB, which replaced SERB. Through our cohort, we did identify that folks were less likely to have accessed CRB than SERB. We didn't get any yes responses to CRB. This might have been a timeline thing. because we started asking that question when CRB was recent. But I think the additional barriers to CRB, which was that you couldn't also be on EI and you couldn't be receiving disability benefits, really created additional barriers for many of our participants. Outside of the scope of Aisha, or like more specifically the 200 folks that we got to talk to during COVID, I can certainly assume some of the difficulties with CERB and then CRB being cut off. I believe CRB ended in October and the retroactive payments have now since ended. And essentially when income supports for a pandemic are ended before the pandemic ends, and folks are still becoming vaccinated and there's still restrictions to maintain social distancing, folks who saw CRB or CERB as a way to work under safe conditions or not work at all, and still, support themselves, was really essential. And if you cut that off prematurely, folks are going to be working when they wouldn't want to be working or feel unsafe working. And I think we know that when folks are forced to work under unideal conditions, it opens up the opportunity for exploitation. So yeah, the premature ending of income supports for those folks who were able to get them is only going to make folks work in ways that they don't feel safe. So it's not good. But we haven't quite got into those responses from our participants yet. Sorry, that was a really long answer.
Thank you for sharing. Thank you for answering that, Jenny. And next we have a question for Mother. Thank you so much for your presentation. And this is from Sophia Myers. We know that a huge percentage of school-aged cisgender girls drop out of sport after the time of puberty. Do you know of any similar data for non-binary and trans youth dropping out of sport at a similar age? My guess is the trend will be very similar. Mother?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I wish there was an answer. To my knowledge, I don't think there's any data on that. Not that I've come across. Like I said, it is like so understudied. There's been, I believe, 5 studies in the world, even including non-binary people, with like a slight focus on them in sport. The one study that's like directly like mine was done in Scotland a few years ago. So like I said, there's so little research on this, so I wish we knew, but no, to my knowledge, I don't know.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that, Mother. We have a next question from Leonara. Thank you to all presenters. Wonderful research you're doing. I have a few questions to Alex. How are long-term care homes differentiated? Are there LTCs that provide better support for their HCA or PSW than others? And what are their characteristics, e.g. ownership, regulatory policies, incentives, and reward structures for workers? Alex, that's a big question. I don't know if you have an answer to that, or you can attempt it.
Yeah, I mean, that's a very comprehensive question. I can touch on it maybe a little bit. So I mean, just in terms of how long-term care homes are differentiated, I would say like at least from my experience with the work and with what I was embedded in, the greatest difference that we observed was actually mostly due to part with privatization. So for some context for that, in 2002, the former BC Liberal government installed legislation that essentially like stripped long-term care workers of their job security and basically allowed long-term care homes and also like hospital settings to like expedite or export their labor to like third parties. We didn't ask questions to our participants that reflected that differentiation. So we didn't ask like, do you work in a privatized setting and like how might they be different? So I wish that I could answer this question a little more thoroughly. But for the most part, I would say across the board, whether or not they were privatized, there were like extensive issues, first of all, with pay and also with benefits. And that was mostly discussed in comparison to other healthcare workers. So one thing that was highlighted is the fact that nurses, like when they work understaffed, they're usually actually compensated more per hour for however much they're working and for how understaffed they are. Long-term care workers are not afforded that same sort of benefit. So yeah, I know that didn't really answer the question, but I just wanted to provide at least whatever context I could.
Yeah, no, thank you, Alex. That is a great question, and for anyone who is here and looking for a research question, you have it. And we have also another question also from Leonara and to Nikki. Unfortunately, Nikki had to leave. And I'm not sure if Alex will be able to answer this because you're working on the same research, the same data. So Leonara is wondering if we have data on how many nurses are infected across Canada, and if there are some regions and hospitals that have higher rates of infection among nurses, and why?
Yeah, so filling in for Nikki, we didn't focus too much on the statistics in EPI. When I was looking into my presentation on long-term care workers, that number that I found that showed how many COVID deaths were attributable to residents in long-term care centers did also cover the amount of infections and deaths attributable to the staff. And I'm sure that I could probably find that database and I would probably show the numbers for nurses. So that's definitely something I can follow up with and answer maybe after this.
Thank you. Yeah, I think when we post this recording, we could have some of these questions answered as well. Thank you for offering, Alex. And we have another question from Julia Smith to Brett. I noticed you didn't have recommendations about sensitizing law enforcement or working with police to improve their ability to provide safety to sex workers. Is this a lost cause? That's a fair question. I don't know if Brett, you want to respond to that.
Yeah, fair question. Easiest to answer, I'm going to say no. But so one say I'll take a stab at it. So in 2013, the Vancouver Police kind of followed like a pseudo end-to-end criminalization model before the actual federal legislation came in, where they were going to prioritize sex worker safety during sex work policing. And results from that, there was a study that went on from Dr. Andrew Crucy, and results from that found that even with policing prioritizing sex worker safety, like in their policies, sex workers still experience reporting violence to the police and engaging with the police as an act of violence. So I'm not necessarily going to say it's a lost cause or one or the other, but to show that even with safety being mandated, sex workers don't necessarily experience the police as safe. But then on the other side, there are some reports that have come out around, there's one around systemic racism in the police, and they set out a bunch of recommendations. I'm not going to, around actually working with the police to try to move past that, I guess. So people still say it's possible. Whether I say it's possible is neither here nor there, but I hope that kind of answered your question.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that. I actually had my own question also related to, sex workers, that, the presentation relating to yours, but also Jenny's. So one of the recommendations from both of the project is decriminalization. I don't know if you two could comment on, what are the barriers right now to decriminalization of sex work?
The barriers. Well, I think ongoing stigma of sex work, really still feeding public perceptions of sex workers as victims needing protection, and that really informing politicians as well, their own opinions, but their willingness to take a bold step in fully decriminalizing sex work. I think it remains controversial in the Canadian context, despite empirical evidence saying that decriminalization of sex work is the best model. So I think it is ongoing morality issues, stigmatization, and you know, frumpy politicians who aren't willing to listen to sex workers and lose you know, popularity. Brett can add to that if he wishes.
I don't really have anything to add. Jenny is yeah, right on the nose. Yeah, it was political will and these gender notions of victimhood and you know, moralism around sex. I think are really big drivers of it.
Yeah, no, thank you for answering that. I think, you know, with the work that you're doing, like, it helps to push back, right, on those moral dilemmas and political will. So it's really great and important work that you're doing. I have another question from Leonara. Thanks, Alex. I have a follow-up question. What do the long-term care workers think about recent changes the BC NDP government introduced to ensure workers have full-time work in one setting and avoid traveling between several homes? Is this policy working?
Thank you for this question. And I love this question too, because it touches on so many things. Like, first of all, the fact that when COVID first started, like, yes, long-term care workers were isolated to one site. And previous to that, typically long-term care workers, the way that they made ends meet was by working on multiple sites at a time. So this change, like, would obviously address that fact and provide more stability for long-term care workers or women working in long-term care. As to, like, their own opinions, we conducted our focus group and interviews back in March of 2021. I'm not sure how recent this change was, but yeah, unfortunately, we weren't able to gather, like, any sort of, like, consensus on that matter. Just with experience of doing my own research on this topic and for this presentation and for our policy brief that we wrote, I can imagine that it is probably super helpful. Like, the one fact is, like, despite the fact that women could travel between sites and work at multiple sites, this definitely still contributed to the fact that long-term care work was unsustainable to begin with. Like, that, you know, like, imagine having to travel, like, you know, 3 hours every day just to make, you know, to go to a job where you're paid maybe minimum wage, if not less, due to privatization. So yeah, once again, unfortunately, I can't fully answer the question, but I would definitely say that it's definitely a step in the right direction. And oh, I did also want to mention, I'm, like, frantically typing on my second computer as questions are coming in, but I did want to also mention that the government has recently reversed privatization, but only right now for custodial and food service workers. So that would obviously include those working in long-term care, but not necessarily for care aides. So yeah, there are a lot of changes that are actually happening right now, and hopefully the policy brief that we're going to be publishing will help contribute to those as well.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Alex. Leonara is very grateful, and she'll be taking these learnings to her teaching. And asking about publications, I think we will be able to post links to some of the publications associated to the work that we had today. And so sorry to put you on the spot, Alex, but you do have another question from Shira. Can you talk a little bit more about the process of developing the recommendations that you shared in your study? Were these generated directly by the data, or were there activities with participants or policymakers that helped shape this?
Yeah, thank you, Shira. And this is actually a question that I can fully answer, thankfully. I can just say right off the bat that policymakers were not involved in the process of developing our recommendations. I wasn't able to expand on this more during my presentation, but part of our framework theory involved like targeting a domain of measures to address. So with every interview transcript or focus group transcript, we're coding and sorting information into like 4 domains, and that was one of them. And so predominantly those recommendations were made based off of what care workers and custodial and food service workers were saying themselves. And a lot of the way that we structured our semi-structured interviews was to ask those questions and ask them like what change they want to see. So it is predominantly based off of what care workers were saying to us personally, or well, not me personally. I didn't attend the focus groups and interviews. And then also by supplementary information. So us kind of doing that research, looking into the fact that a lot of these roles were privatized and like what sort of effect that has.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for sharing that, Alex. And we do have a question for Jenny from Sylvia Machat. Do you have any hypothesis about Indigenous sex workers' low access to SARB? As you pointed out, it seems unusual. You had mentioned taxes, but you also mentioned that PACE was assisting sex workers with doing paperwork to access SARB. So I'm curious about your take on this.
Hi, Sylvia. Yeah, sure. I'll answer the taxes and community organization question first. It's probably a bit simpler. So I think that community orgs were taking on the task of helping folks apply to SERB, like getting online and, logging into their account and doing all that. But I think there was still a barrier that help could only be provided to folks who had filed taxes in 2019. So I think it still is like identifying two different groups. And I think there was also kind of a lag in time and when folks weren't sure if they were able to get on SERB, if they were eligible, what the repercussions down the road would be, and with like tax returns the next year. So I think there was also a bit of a gap. Some people maybe were eligible and had filed taxes and weren't comfortable applying for SERB until maybe a community org was able to explain the process to them. So I think it is two groups, and there's definitely still a barrier. Like if you didn't apply for taxes the year before, you maybe weren't going to ask for help with getting on SERB. In respect to your question about Indigenous folks having less access, it is an interesting finding, and yeah, descriptively, we see lower odds of SERB access among Indigenous sex workers compared to white sex workers. It was significant in our bivariate findings and not in our multivariate, like it dropped from the model. So we might see that there's like other variables explaining that. It might be worthwhile to run a confounder model to see if those two things are independently linked. That's something we haven't yet got to, but I am definitely interested in that aspect of the analysis because nationally, Indigenous women had higher odds of getting on SERB because they're overrepresented in service and low wage jobs. So I think it's an important thing to really get at. So thanks for raising that.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that answer, Jenny. I'm wondering if there is anyone in attendance who would like to voice out their question. I think we have time for one more question. No, we do have a final question. I'll just say it's a final question, but if you have like a last minute question, please put it down. And it's for Mother. Do you happen to have any educational resources at hand to help coaches or other authority figures in sport make their teams more accommodating to non-binary folks?
Yeah, I've found some ones for transgender athletes. Most of them don't have any mention of non-binary athletes. So you kind of just have to connect the dots and apply how you see fit. But yeah, I can put some transgender applicable ones in the chat. Most of them are American. because apparently we're kind of slow on that over here, but there are a couple.
Yeah, and that question also maybe comes as a suggestion for resources to be put together. No, thank you for that question. Well, thank you everyone for your active participation, and the presenters, you've got lots of love in the chat. Thank you so much for this important work that you're doing. And that is it for us. So that has been the CGSHE inaugural Trainee Research Symposium. And if you would like to learn more about events like this, please visit our website and follow us on social media. And you can also sign up for our newsletter. So I think that should be a link there, or if you visit our website, you'll find all those resources. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of your day.